Hi, I'm Noam Maital, and welcome to the GovAI Podcast. AI is the most powerful technology of our time, and government is still figuring out how to navigate this new frontier. Join me as we explore how artificial intelligence is transforming public service, unlocking potential efficiencies, the risks that no one's talking about, and what happens when innovation moves faster than regulation. Today's guest is someone I've gotten to know closely over the past year and someone whose vision I've come to deeply admire. In fact, so much so that I'm actually a small angel investor in their company. So I'm really excited to have Dr. Amit Elazari. She's the co-founder and CEO of Open Policy. It's a company that's tackling one of the most overlooked bottlenecks, I think, in the AI era, which is how policy actually gets made, interpreted, how we act on it. So she's not just another expert with an opinion, she's actually building the real tools to make policy navigatable, hard word, for everyone. And not just a company with these big lobbying arms. And we'll talk a lot about that as well. That credential comes by leading global cybersecurity policy at Intel. She's a legal scholar with a doctorate from Berkeley Law. She taught at Berkeley and Eichmann University in Israel, speaks regularly at RSA, Black Hat, South by Southwest. You get the picture. But more than all that, Amit has a rare clarity on how the technology and governance actually interact in our world. And in this episode, we're going to dive deep into that around cybersecurity, AI, how companies outside of Fortune 500 start shaping policy conversation instead of just reacting to it, and what it looks like to build governance infrastructure, and what it might take to shift that balance of influence in the AI era away from just the big players, which is what we're used to. So, Amit, thank you for joining the GovAI podcast.
Thank you. Such an honor to be here. Huge fan of podcast, by
Thank
the
you.
way.
So I want to start, usually when I have entrepreneurs, I'm always fascinated by the origin story. But in your case, I'm even more fascinated by it because how does someone get into the policy world, right? Deep into it, all the way to kind of PhD level and running policy at Intel. Walk me through that origin story. And then what was that moment that you said, I actually need to build a company around this?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's a joke also around DC that, they kind of, obviously I was born and raised in Tel Aviv, so they let one Israeli in, and now I'm like entrepreneuring, the policy profession with AI, obviously. So, actually a pretty unexpected story. I came from the law. I worked a lot on technology and law, and we passed it in technology and in different areas. I had an opportunity to go basically do a PhD in the law, what we call a JSD, which is a third degree in law. It's a great question. Why do anyone need 3 degrees in the law at Berkeley? This is kind of after you practice law and you deal with technology, right? At the highest level, you really want to be studying at the NBA, right? Of technology law, and that's Berkeley. And I had an opportunity to really work with some of the most amazing scholars in the world and get more exposed to this tremendous domain called policy. If you think about it, really a profession that exists at scale at hubs like Washington, D.C. and Brussels, where technology, the largest companies in the world, and policymakers come together, right, with think tanks to define the next evolution of, not just how policies and laws are going to look at regulated technology, but frankly, the market, right? If you really go to the core of it, policy is one of the most foundational powers shaping market demand and requirements. And so when I was at Berkeley, I got to, move a little bit from just practicing law to writing laws and creating proposals for policy. And the craziest story is that, I happened to do my PhD in intellectual property and contracts. And my sister, who is a hacker, she was starting to talk with me about like bug bounties and this amazing world of hackers. And I ended up doing a large-scale research there that ended up as a policy proposal that got adopted by the American legislators and the Supreme Court of the United States in the area of law and hacking and thousands of organizations. And I became exposed to this power of policy, and I got headhunted by Intel Corporation. And so after spending 4.5 years at Intel and really practicing policy at the time when Intel passed the CHIPS Act with others, right? It was a very critical time for government affairs at the company. and seeing how this profession is being practiced before generative AI, and also experiencing the promise of generative AI, two things became clear to me. That this is a very important profession for the business, that people that practice policy see the future of the market, and they have very expertise being able to work with business leaders and technology leaders to help them think about, to take that knowledge about policy and translate it to business development, right? Um, but a very small set of, the ecosystem, what we call the 1%, was really able to practice policy, right? Because it was just a small profession with a small amount of experts. So with generative AI was starting, and I saw the tools around there, and I had the opportunity to experience this myself. It became clear to me that there will be an opportunity to bring policy to more players, B, replicate and scale the policy expertise and bring that to the business. And finally, that a lot more companies, startups, unicorns, investors, companies of all sizes are going to be required, right, because of the shifts in the dynamics to invest in policy, but will be able to just create more business value from this tremendous, interaction between policy and technology. And so,
Policy. I have some questions more on the origin story, but I want to, for a second, shift there because at a high level, right? And correct me if I'm misrepresenting, but you guys are providing access to companies that didn't have access to be in the game of policy and its implications before.
yeah, because, I think it's important to recognize there are a few pieces there. So we also work with companies that have, amazing government affairs leaders, companies like Snowflake, for example, that are very established and are, in the conversation. But our goal is really to scale the connectivity, scale the government affairs function, and above all, scale the connectivity between that and the business. And a lot of what we do is we work with companies that are deeply impacted by policy because either policy is defining their entire go-to-market. So think about security companies, cybersecurity companies, where 50% of the reason the buyers, the CISOs, the organizations in charge of a budget is spending money is not just the threat landscape, it's compliance.
Mhm.
And so these companies are really impacted by policy, but maybe before open policy could not really get a solution that helps not just monitor policy, but translate that into business value connected to the go-to-market. So that's part of our base of customers. And I'm talking all the way to pre-seed level customers, right? All the way to large companies that have government affairs in the public sector. We also work with the public sector. And those organizations just need a much more powerful, customized tool to be able to get that connectivity and monitoring of policy into the entire organization. And so we are kind of working across the scale, but the easiest thing or way to think about open policy is really training the best in class AI and creating knowledge engineering and data processes that bring the value to policy to each and every piece of the business while scaling the policy expertise and enabling companies to engage much more effectively in the organization.
So, I, from experience, and I can say this is applicable also for Darwin, when you operate within an area of opportunity, there's things that are broken. And I think when I think about policy, I think generally the feeling is that there's something broken or out of reach for most of these organizations. So
Right.
why is that? Well, why is it that we have that feeling? Companies go away with that feeling. Again, if you're not the Fortune 500 of today, why is it something that feels passive that's just happening to us? What's
Mhm.
the shift, right, in terms of how that we should be thinking about?
And actually, we actually hear this also from the public sector. I mean, not every department or every individual in the public sector, certainly not on the state and local side, have the same resource that a very large Department of Defense has with legislative, experts that are constantly on the hill and have that ability to predict requirements. So overall, I think it all starts from the historical, I think, bottleneck of experts, not even just the resource, just a small bottleneck of experts that are experts in a specific policy. So let's, we are on a podcast. We have you. We are talking about AI. Let's take an example. There is a very small amount of people that are really experts at, I would say, foundational AI or generative AI policy, because these type of experts are getting trained at, again, what was traditionally a very small university, right? Where do you get to practice that? You work at Anthropic, you work with OpenAI, you work with some of those organizations, and you learn this amazing profession. But this is shifting because with generative AI, we have this rare ability to take tons of context, tons of information, train models and get that expertise replicated. And so the traditional thinking about policy and government affairs that it's all connections. And the reality is that, yeah, that's a key piece of the puzzle, but it's also expertise. It's what we call coalitions and the ability to come together as a group, which is a lot of what we do. I think it's really a great time for businesses and the public sector, for those of us listening us, to reflect on two things. A, how critical policy is for their operations, for their mission, for the business. And turns out you can't really afford to be reactive in this, day and age. You have to be proactive, even to just go to market. And B, that I do feel like in many other areas where we had the small amount set of experts, this is a wonderful time to look at the tools and solutions available, right, to get yourself a lot more immersed and a lot more connected to this amazing domain to get value. So I think the perception is from how historically the profession is operated. It's an amazing profession, but with a small amount of expertise that's traditionally very expensive. And the opportunity is just what we are seeing across the board. Generative AI's ability to bring.
Let's double click on that to specifics. So let's say I'm a mid-sized Series B cybersecurity company. Walk me through like a concrete impact, right? Something specific, right? That if I'm looking at my go-to-market, my product roadmap, I would see a direct hit or benefit from being in the playground of policy and having influence.
That's great. So I like to take a typical example. One of the sisters in Amazon, shared with me a quote that I got his approval and is very prominent in our decks. And he says, 50% of, of my budget is coming from regulation, or the Digital Services Act or the UA Act. When a legislation like that happens, it opens up budget. And then if I'm a cybersecurity company and I don't understand 50% of why my buyer is buying a product, then I have a product market fit problem, right? Every founder would agree with that, right? Every sales leader would agree with that. And I think traditionally folks have kind of neglected to think about which regulations, which policies driving the adoption of my tool, because there was just no exposure to that question or to that set of expertise. So the first thing we do is we talk about the connection between policy to revenue. So policy is happening all the time and it's driving your business adoption. If you're selling to SLED, if you're selling to the federal government, it's not just cybersecurity. And if you're selling any solution in AI, fraud, compliance, privacy, GRC, security, it is impacting the decision-making of the buyer, whether they admit it or not. And so the first thing is to be aware exactly of what is that go-to-market story that you're missing. And we are able to connect it with our tools today immediately, including as things are shifting, which is the hardest piece: your product, your buyer, and the policy. The second piece is about shaping the policy. And I think that's for me the most exciting opportunity to democratize access to policy. And this is really about the art of coming together, finding partners, filing comments, right? And being able to engage not just in the reactive side of, hey, the policy is coming out and how I'm adjusting my technology. We really think about also policy, something that is today integral, like it's part of products, right? And it could be very expensive, right, to potentially shift a product because of lack of awareness of policy, but also being able to shape the policy. And so for us, I would say actually the areas where we found the biggest immediate kind of lighting bulb moment was when people were completely unaware that a regulation is driving the decision making until they started to hear this from customers. And we want to avoid that. We want to make sure that if you're a Series B company in cybersecurity, you're already putting a lot of money into marketing, you better be telling that go-to-market story that it's just not around the threats, it's also around the policy. And that shift is immediate. That's a very exciting lighting bulb, but we see all the time. And the fun is it's a 180, right? Because it's not shaping policy can take 3 months, 6 months. It is a little bit more strategic, but the connection between policy to revenue, that's immediate. And so that's kind of the best way to think.
In the nuances, it gets complex. If to simplify this also for the listeners, most of our listeners would remember GDPR passing in Europe, and it's like a watershed moment of pass fail, right? If you're not compliant, you can't sell in EU. And so,
Yeah,
right. So
an
it
extra.
just was a
Hmm.
complete stop for any company that was not prepared. And there was a scramble that was happening. A lot of procrastinating companies that waited last minute. I think there's a ton of nuance of policies that are in between that to your point, unless you're in the weeds of it or shaping it, then you kind of get left behind. So on the shaping part, I want to take that thought and extend it a bit, because one of the things I'm sure people will appreciate your input on, and it's a tricky one, is okay, EU took this kind of expansive approach around regulatory policy around AI. And then the US came and said, hold my beer. We're going to do this whole messy thing where every state passes their own AI laws. And then we have a new president come in, change some of that laws and policy. And in the interim of that, we even had with a portion of the big, beautiful bill, a 10-year moratorium
Motor.
on state regulation around AI. Help us understand this Wild West of policy, and what is the right balance here between the states managing their regulation and AI policy to innovation to federal approach from a top-down legislation?
So let's just take 30 seconds or 60 seconds to talk about the landscape because it's fascinating, right? So, where I personally think we're going, I mean, we definitely have the EUA Act in full force, being implemented with a new code of practice for generative AI being released. And what's interesting about the EU, there is always a set of standards, right? European standards and international standards that are being developed. We are actually also participating in that process as well. I personally was a part of SE42, where we're still active in defining standards. So all that is happening in the background. That's going to be more technology specific with a higher bar on market access. But obviously, because of the European, what we call the Brussels effect, the European impact on the entire market, it continues to be very much impactful, especially for, foundational model developers, Fortune 500, etc. Which means that I've encountered many many companies that are very focused on the US market, but they cannot afford to ignore any European regulation because their buyers, which are Fortune 500, which are the logos that the startups want to acquire, care about it, which is a great reason, by the way, why you should be so thoughtful about thinking on integration of policy, because you don't want to ignore the fact that your buyer cares about a particular regulation, and it might not be as straightforward to connect the dots. So that is happening. We obviously had an executive order from Trump that got, from Biden that got revoked. And what's interesting is we do have right now a very critical federal policy on AI that is starting to get adopted on the SLED and state side. So for folks on the line that are not tracking the memos that came out of the Office of Management of Budget, a lot of the requirements around the secure development of AI, the trusted development of AI, are very much, there are a lot of requirements still in effect. Some of them, might seem similar to previous requirements on the technical side that were actually also in effect before. So, that is a key document that if you're developing an AI that might go to the federal market, you should think about. So we have that on the federal level. We know that NIST, and also this is coming from the Trump administration, there's still a lot of development of AI guidance coming at NIST. There is still a center for AI testing. And what we saw is that moratorium did not progress, right? On that, there was a proposal, it had a lot of support, but did not progress at this stage, which tells us a little bit, of course, about the dynamics. I think we will continue to see a fabric of policy on the state level, certainly when it comes to the procurement of AI, where the state has a lot of discretion, right? And this will probably continue. We will continue to see some state fabrication, what we call fragmentation. I'm sorry, and I think that is something that would, it has potential to hinder innovation. But what's very clear is you cannot afford ignoring, right, the dynamics.
I think part of it too is we're still in the moment around AI that's before the kind of memorable moment of the why, meaning when you look at cybersecurity, not non AI oriented, at the state level, at least I can tell you this is true of federal. Ransomware is top of mind for a lot of these agencies, but they haven't yet really felt the impact of what ransomware looks like in the age of AI, where penetration and modular thinking from LLM based approach that's much more dynamic is starting, that could be kind of a new attack vector. And I think things like that. I mean, there's other examples I could give. Another one would be um, simple FOIA and public disclosure requests. So again, for the listeners who don't know, uh, public agencies have the need to disclose public records, anything they do within the organization. That was fine when a document you wrote in Word, you wrote it. Every meeting now that's recorded can be public records if you're a government entity, which creates a massive headache and challenge around that. So that alone brings about the thought of, okay, what do you do around the policy? So I guess to turn this around into the question back to you, I'm giving you the magic wand, and you are now advising. Let's not take a big federal agency. Let's go small. I like to work with the state and local. Let's take a mid-sized city across the U.S., and you are advising the CIO with the magic wand. What do you tell them to do in terms of their policy for the next few years?
Fantastic question. And this is also why we are so passionate about, ourselves being, a federal contractor and working with the public sector ourselves, because we actually believe that tracking policy shouldn't be as complex for the public sector and to democratize the skill set, right? Because there are a lot of agencies, especially on the SLED side, public sector bodies that cannot afford or don't simply have the human resource to have this monitored with humans. But these individuals still need very much access to policy to make critical decisions about procurement, about direction, etc. So my best advice would be, there is a reason why, including in the federal level, we are starting to see requirements for security, for the foundation models, but also for thinking about how the adoption of AI is shifting the attack surface for the entire system. So it's not just about how securely the AI is being developed. You got to be inventorying your AI. You got to be thinking about data leakage. You got to be thinking about how the adoption of AI is creating new risks for the entire organization. And my advice would be, if I'm a state CEO or CAO, sorry, or I'm operating at that level, I think there is a misconception about the amount of best practices and policies that are already there. There are already federal procurement requirements, right? And I talked about OMB Memo 2521 as one example, but there are others that are being implemented as we speak. There are fantastic companies like Doran that help you understand that and help you adopt best-in-class governance frameworks as well. And I think I would absolutely want to be tracking policy closely, be not discounting this, and we need to also think about trust and security, right? As I'm adopting, I think we think about that balance of productivity and security, but the reality is with AI, we have to know where the AI is, and we have to be thinking about security as we adopt AI. And see my best advice is, I think there are already frameworks coming out of NIST and other places where you can be adopting AI, but also relying on best practices and, more importantly, technologies that bring governance using AI and other technology and make it much more approachable. The approach of compliance with checklists is moving away from the public sector. The best example is SWIFT and FedRAMP 20X and many frameworks that are looking into automating compliance. And I think this is where we're going to be going also on the SLED and, state and local level. And so these are just three ideas of where, I would think about not just the importance of tracking policy, and we're happy to help there, but to be empowered to adopt AI securely.
So let's in your magic toolkit, we'll take away the magic wand and now give you crystal ball.
I love it. All the tools. Yeah.
The beauty of a podcast, you can make it up as you go around your toolkit. So 10 years forward, 2035, what does the vision look like for open policy in kind of the utopia of how policy, AI governance, and the productivity across both government and interaction with the private sector companies as well?
Love it. I mean, we said it. I mean, we believe that um, there is so much power in contributing to shaping policy. It's not just good for society that innovative companies and entrepreneurial companies are participating in the conversation. It's good for policy, and it's ultimately also good for businesses and go to market. And our vision is that it needs to be much more democratized and simple. So we want to be working with the public sector and the private sector. We already work with some of the world's best companies, like Wiz, like Snowflake, like Armies, many of the AI leaders to bring, policy at scale to the organizations. Obviously, the vision for us is to continue and refine our capabilities, continue to grow like that, and very excited about our public sector adoption as well. But I think beyond that, I think the area of policy where I believe that we are pretty unique in doing advocacy, if you look at our comments, but is really important, and I hope there is broader adoption, is the entire area of policy as code and technology, using technology for governance adoption. And I think the promise of bringing policy expertise to AI is not just to democratize who participates in the conversation and better connected to the go-to-market. It's also make it much more available for other technologies to be monitoring policy and adopting the framework. So compliance, and not just compliance, just like policy adoption becomes a much more scalable discipline. That's where I see policy going. And I think that's important because not every company has not just a tool to protect themselves from ransomware, but the tools to, the lawyers and the budgets to protect themselves from fines and just staying compliant. And I think with policy as code, with technology as governance, and with the opportunity of so many more and more entrepreneurial companies joining the GRC in this space, but also becoming policy aware, we can democratize access to that too.
Just to add on that last point, I think a good example where we didn't do it right is when we think about social media, where social media came about, kind of erupted, free market, right, adoption across the world. And we really didn't have any policy in place around any of it. No guardrails, no thinking around how that scales, implications. I think we're now learning, especially with recent events, what are some of the consequences of that. AI is going to be, in my mind, more impactful than social media in terms of its broad consequences to businesses, to independence, to the market, the job market. If we don't do a good job in framing the behavior we want to see, but also how we get productivity out of it, then we're going to end up with the Wild West we have now, but Wild West kind of at maturity. That's kind of scary to think about.
So there is a role in policy that is called private ordering. And the reality is when we don't have policy at all, what happens usually is either contracts become the policy, so we call it private ordering, or technology itself becomes the policy. And so I think to your excellent point is like, we just need to be constantly aware that, there's a tremendous balance, obviously, with not having too much policy. And of course, we want to make sure we have innovation, but we also need to be very aware that if there isn't a policy, usually there isn't a vacuum. There is just a different form of ordering, and it's either technology or private. And private could be really good for business. We just need to be aware of what it is. And so it's a more academic, but a very interesting takeaway for our audience.
So let's move. We're going to do now 2 minutes of kind of lightning round. Let's start on the regulation side. So what is one thing on the policy or regulation side that you think more people should actually read? Like sit down and read the policy.
Well, we are in an AI, podcast. I maybe not. It's an OMB memo, and this is why it's really important for me to highlight this. So I'm sure a lot of folks have been tracking the moratorium issue, but go ahead and read OMB memo 2521. I actually know a couple of the authors, but it's just a very important, document in terms of defining the future of federal AI requirements. And so I'm kind of guessing a lot of the audience cares about AI and policy. So that will be my choice.
What would you say for startups here that are listening and are builders? What is the mistake that you keep seeing companies make in this space or kind of within the GovTech environment?
Not knowing which policy is driving their technology adoption. I'm not saying that, I mean, obviously we solve that question and we will give you the answers, and the answers tend to change a lot with the buyers and with time and your technology, and we do that all the time. So yes, we're a perfect solution if you want to get the answer, but I do feel like, not understanding that part of your cell motion is connected to policy and not thinking about what is that policy, whether it's a standard, whether it's a compliance, and understanding your buyer from that perspective is just it's a blind side. And so that's the thing I would say.
So what would you say is, for you, it's not to say biggest mistake, but the biggest challenge has been about building company, not even generally about AI, kind of what's been the hardest part about building open policy?
So first of all, we're a services and software. Like, think about, we have taken a process that for the longest time, wasn't scaled by AI or any automation, but B, wasn't really sold to 99% of the market. And we are trying to tackle both at the same time, which we love because it's a blue ocean. I mean, but I would say two elements. I think for any company, it is usually product market fit. I mean, we are very lucky to found it, but we are redefining it, because I think if you're a services or software company, you're bringing new value to new buyers. And so for us, we are actually selling the entire organization, which is, we don't just deal with one buyer. So I think that's a challenge that on one side we love, because, it makes policy sticky. On the other side, it is obviously always a challenge to have multiple buyers in the org. So I would say that's the one.
And having gotten to know you over the last year, I'd say if there's someone that is resilient to those challenges, it's you. So, Amit, I want to thank you for joining me today. I love having someone I can geek out on policy. So thank you. I'm sure there's a ton of value also for the listeners here. And so thank you again, Amit, for joining us today.
You got it. Thank you for your time.
That's it for this episode of the GovAI Podcast. AI is reshaping governance in real time. And as we've seen, the path forward is filled with both promise and complexity. But conversations like this, open, challenging, forward-thinking, are how we shape a smarter, more responsible future. The GovAI Podcast is produced by Poldu. Our editor is Noam Maital, with production assistance from Shani Roth and Shakel Dror. We'll be back in 2 weeks to tackle more challenges and explore creative solutions at the intersection of AI and the public sector. Until then, stay curious, stay critical, and never forget that even the sharpest tools mean nothing without the hand that wields them.